Good evening. For the first time in 5 years, strikes will hit all tube lines across the network. The 24-hour action starts from midnight tonight and threatens the hesitant steps back to office working Londoners have been taking these last few weeks. With very little chance of any trains running, we're all being urged to work from home. The walkout has been called by the RMT union in a row over jobs and pensions. Our political correspondent Simon Harris is outside Russell Square station for us this evening. Simon, how difficult will it be getting around town tomorrow then?
Duncan, for anyone who relies on the tube, getting around London tomorrow could be very difficult. London Underground says there may be no trains running at all. There was a brief meeting between the two sides this morning, but the RMT failed to get the concessions it wanted or guarantees it wanted on pensions, jobs and other terms and conditions. That means tomorrow's strike is on.
There may be no London Underground services on Tuesday and Thursday. Please consider working from home if you are able to do so.
Just days after the government ended most COVID restrictions, Londoners are once again being asked to work from home. That was the advice from tube bosses on the eve of tomorrow's strike. The walkout by RMT members is expected to cause severe disruption, with the possibility of the entire underground system at a standstill.
It's either have to take annual leave or, if manager allows, work from home.
I'm very frustrated. I'm an American business person here for the week and now I need to make different plans.
I'm actually working from home the next 3 days, so I'm going to be fine.
COVID has left Transport for London on the verge of bankruptcy. The RMT believes there are more job cuts coming down the line, as well as changes to the TfL pension scheme. Transport for London has been given around £5 billion in government bailouts to cover its losses during the pandemic. One of the strings attached to those payments is that TfL must carry out a review of its generous pension scheme. TfL workers pay up to 5% of their salary into their pensions pot. In return, TfL contributes more than 6 times the amount. The pension scheme costs TfL about £375 million a year.
We've got a document, they haven't denied its existence. It reveals £100 million worth of pension savings to be delivered every year going forward. I asked them this morning, rule that out then, if this is a figure you don't recognise, and he said he couldn't do that.
London Underground believes the strike is at the very least premature because the pensions review is still underway and no decisions have been taken.
What I would say is that strike action will not help. It's in nobody's interest, and we've been clear that we can't, and no organisation in a position that we're in would be able to provide assurances and guarantees that nothing will change.
The last strike to bring the Underground to a halt was in 2017. It led to gridlock on the roads and chaotic queues at bus stops. Working from home might lessen the impact of this strike on commuters, but that's no comfort for London's business community.
It's going to hit businesses of all sizes in different ways, and it's going to be disruptive to Londoners' lives at the very time that they're wanting to get back to the activities that they've been missing for the last couple of years.
The strike will be repeated on Thursday, with knock-on disruption expected during the morning rush hour on Wednesday and Friday. Last week, TfL was given another £200 million by the government to keep it afloat until the end of June. Talks on a long-term funding settlement continue, but ministers want TfL to be sustainable. That's paying for itself by April 2023. So there are going to have to be some tough decisions about what it can afford in the future. And the union is probably right to worry on behalf of its members. After all, that's what it's supposed to do. Having said that, the other unions, including the train drivers' union ASLEF, aren't taking strike action at this time. And TfL continues to insist that no changes to the pension scheme have been proposed and no one will lose their job.
Thank you, Simon.
Good evening. It was the first of 2 24-hour tube strikes planned for this week, and it certainly did not fail to bring the capital to a standstill. This morning, all underground services were suspended. Roads in central London have been gridlocked ever since, and commuters have had a pretty miserable day trying to get around the city. The walkout was sparked by a dispute over pensions and working conditions. But after our roads saw record numbers of drivers, we're being warned to expect more of the same on Thursday. Here's our political correspondent, Simon Harris.
If tube workers wanted to bring London to a standstill, they won't have been disappointed. The shutdown of the underground system caused gridlock on the roads. Ambulance crews were confronted with a challenge. Other drivers faced frustration.
It's a nightmare, can't get anywhere.
Too many roads up this way have been closed off and you just can't get anywhere. Horrible. 6.5 hours to do an hour trip.
While the roads were rammed, the underground was largely deserted. Stations were locked and trains parked in sidings and depots. There was an infrequent shuttle service on the Wimbledon branch of the District Line, the first arriving at West Brompton at around 8 o'clock. Most commuters here were relying on the overground, but they were in for a nasty surprise. Behind these gates are the platforms for the London Overground. The trains are running, but frustratingly for commuters, they're not stopping. West Brompton was one of a dozen overground stations where it turns out the staff were employed by London Underground, which meant they were on strike.
I'm new in London and I don't have any other option except this and perhaps an Uber, which is going to cost me a lot.
The overground's really frustrating because we could easily kind of make it work, but that being out just means there's absolutely no chance of getting anywhere.
It's just a total nightmare. Nothing's running, traffic's increased. Not sure it's doing anything for our carbon footprint as a city either.
In the cold and wet, commuters queued for buses. With no tube in central London, rail passengers arriving at main-like stations like Waterloo had little choice. Eve, who runs a coffee stall next to Temple Station, saw her takings cut in half.
Business is slow because of the strike, but I do support the strike. I want to be really clear about that. Support the TfL workers striking for their pay and conditions.
The RMT called the strike partly in response to a review of Transport for London's pension scheme, demanded by ministers in return for government cash during COVID.
This has all happened because of the complete ineptitude of the mayor and the government wrangling around money and proper financing for the tube.
How much are you to blame?
Well, the RMT recognised that the government's attached conditions to the funding deal. The only reason we need this funding deal from the government is because Londoners did the right thing and stayed at home. At one stage, we were losing 95% of our income.
Yes, the government have insisted on pension reforms because at the moment, the pensions that the RMT via London Transport get are the gold-plated. They are better than any other public sector pension.
For many commuters, it was going to be a long journey home, with the promise of more of the same on Thursday when the next strike begins.
And Simon's at Russell Square this evening. Simon, the first of two strikes were this week. What are the chances of Thursday's walkout being called off?
The signs aren't encouraging, Ronke. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, had his say today, saying that Londoners had been given a kick in the teeth after the £5 billion bailout, and he called on TfL, the Mayor and the RMT to settle the dispute. The problem is the RMT wants guarantees that the pension scheme won't be tampered with. The Mayor and TfL say they can't give those guarantees while the review of the pension scheme is underway. That won't deliver its findings until the spring. And the bad news is that there are no talks planned as far as we know. Also, before Thursday's strike kicks in, there's going to be more disruption tomorrow morning, according to TfL, as the service tries to get back to normal.
Good evening. We've heard a lot about wealthy Russians and oligarchs and their links to the capital since the start of the war in Ukraine. But tonight, a clearer picture is being painted of just how much money they've invested in property portfolios in London. The figure stands at £1.1 billion, and most of the properties are in Westminster, not far from Parliament. Their MPs didn't let the scale of the issue go unnoticed. The Labour leader called on the Prime Minister to extend sanctions to two oligarchs who own properties here, and one of them is Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has the latest.
Who wouldn't want to live in a house like this? Whitehall Court is an imposing Victorian pile a stone's throw from Parliament. The best apartments have views over the Thames, and according to the Labour leader, two of them belong to this man. Igor Shuvalov is a former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia and, said Sir Keir Starmer, one of the cronies who props up Putin's regime.
Shuvalov owns two flats, not 5 minutes walk from this house. They're worth over £11 million. He is on the EU sanctions list, but he's not on the UK sanctions list. When will the Prime Minister sort this out?
There is more to be done, and thanks to the powers that this House and this government has taken, we can sanction any individual, any company connected connected with the Putin regime.
Sakir wanted to know why Roman Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea Football Club, wasn't facing sanctions.
He's a person of interest to the Home Office because of his links to the Russian state and his public association with corrupt activity and practices.
But the Prime Minister had nothing to say about Mr Abramovich.
It's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases at this stage.
An investigation by an anti-corruption campaign reveals oligarchs and wealthy Russians own £1.1 billion worth of property in London. Almost a third of them are in the city of Westminster.
You have to ask yourself why people want to keep their identity secret. And in some cases, that will be because the way they have become wealthy is not something that they want to have open to question. And that's often the case in corruption.
We also know there are businesses, sports clubs and other things which have been used as a vehicle to launder money from Russian people by oligarchs close to Putin. The government needs to step up, take action now.
Earlier today, the mayor met Ukraine's ambassador to London, who passed on a message from the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko. Asked what help he'd like from the mayor of London, Klitschko apparently replied, anti-tank rockets. Simon Harris, ITV News, Holland Park.
Good evening. On the roads, buses and trains, for the second time this week, Londoners were caught up in a major tube strike. The unions' fight to guarantee their members' pension rights made life tough for the rest of us to get to work. Disapproval too, though, for the Mayor Sadiq Khan in Parliament and at the NME Awards last night. We'll have more on that in a moment. First, our political correspondent, Simon Harris, reports on another day of dispute and disruption.
For tens of thousands of Londoners, working from home wasn't an option. For the second time this week, it meant crowded trains, bus queues and expensive taxis if you could find one.
We've had to get Ubers and taxis and try and find buses, and none of this is available. It's expensive. It's just not good.
On Tuesday, I travelled 2.5 hours and had to spend 70 quid to get into work.
Basically, I had to add another hour onto my journey to get to work.
London Underground managed to run a skeleton service on the Central, District and Northern lines, but only in the outer suburbs.
It's just a godsend they're doing little services like this, otherwise absolute carnage.
When I was coming back on Tuesday, it took me 3.5 hours to get home.
The number of people using public transport in London was down on Tuesday, suggesting more commuters stayed at home. It's now mid-morning and this is one of the few trains running on the District line. It's a shuttle service between Kensington and Wimbledon, and as you can see, not many people are taking advantage of it. Greg runs a baking business in Park Royal. His DIY Easter egg kits are in demand at this time of year, but he was on his own today. His employees couldn't get in, so he had no sympathy for the striking tube workers.
They are well paid. I mean, it's not like they get badly paid. There are people who work for minimum wage in London and they can't get to work, so it's not fair. It's just really not fair on everybody, businesses and commuters.
T-Woon opened his coffee stall outside North Acton station for the first time today and surprisingly was grateful for the strike.
I needed to practice. I needed to make sure everything was operable before it got busy so I'm not bombarded on the day one.
Inevitably, there were more cars on London's roads and today's strike coincided with a pollution warning.
This is because there was pollution coming in with the weather system from the continent. So to have that coming into London and then to have the extra traffic on the roads meant that it was, additionally bad from an air quality point of view.
The RMT and London Underground are in dispute over plans to abolish 600 jobs when there are vacancies and because Transport for London's generous pension scheme is under review.
What we need is some guarantees that our pensions won't be attacked, that we won't have to suffer this £100 million cuts from our members' benefits, and that we'll have some job security and there will be no imposed changes to terms and conditions.
This dispute is completely unnecessary. We have not made any proposals to change terms and conditions. We've got no proposals or plans to change the pension scheme, and there will be no redundancies despite the claims of the RMT.
The union says it will now take stock before deciding if it's going to call more strikes.
Well, Simon's at Earl's Court as people try to get home this evening. And it's not just commuters who are frustrated by today's strike, Simon.
That's right, Ria. The strike suddenly became an unexpected hot topic at last night's NME Awards in Brixton. Sadiq Khan was there as a VIP guest, and if he thought he was in for a nice night out, he may have had a bit of a surprise. Two grime stars on stage to present prizes said to the mayor, Sadiq, you need to sort these trains out. People need to get to work. at which point people in the audience started booing. Perhaps less unexpected was the criticism the Mayor got today from some Tory MPs in the Commons.
The government has very generously supplied £4.5 billion to cover the loss of income to Transport for London. The trade unions this week, for the second day this week, have brought London literally to a halt. At this time, of course, there's one person who's completely silent about that, the do-nothing Mayor of London.
He refers to the do-nothing Mayor. Of course, he was very vocal when he was standing for election in saying that he would not allow strike days to happen on the London Underground, and frankly his record on strikes has been absolutely appalling.
A spokesperson for the Mayor said far from doing nothing under his leadership, TfL was on course to make a profit until coronavirus came along. He described the strikes today as disappointing and damaging and called on the RMT to get back around the negotiating table. But at the moment, Ria, there are no plans for any talks.
OK, thank you, Simon.